What's up, everybody? Today we are doing a tier list. We are ranking all of the cantrips in Baldur's Gate 3. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I have done a best cantrips video. I've ranked, I think it was the top 8 plus a couple runners up. I've decided to do this format instead. One, everybody likes tier lists, right? But also, I think it's just helpful if we go through all of the cantrips, not just the ones that I consider the best. Because there are some B and even C tier cantrips that I think are still pretty decent. And situationally, they can be pretty good. So my plan is to do this for all of the spells, and we'll start with the cantrips today. Alright, so we're just going to run through these in alphabetical order. First up is Acid Splash. It's a conjuration cantrip that's available to the Sorcerer, Wizard, and Eldritch Knight. You throw a bubble of acid that damages each creature it hits. It does 1d6 acid damage. Some things that could be considered a pro for this spell is that it's an AoE spell. Acid is a less resistant damage type. That said, there's a lot of cons to this cantrip. The 1d6 is relatively low damage, and despite it being an AoE spell, the area of effect is rather small. But the big count against this cantrip is the fact that it's a save cantrip. When it comes to save cantrips, I'm going to grade them on a lower scale than cantrips that require an attack roll. They're simply not as good, and here's why. With regular spells, when your target succeeds their save, they still take half damage. Like if you cast Firebolt, which is a 3rd level spell that requires a dex save, and your target succeeds in making that save, they still take half of the amount of damage. So it's never a total miss. However, with cantrips, it's different. When your target succeeds in their saving throw from a cantrip, they actually take no damage. And in addition to that, and this applies to all spells that require a save, you can't crit with them, and you can't apply certain bonuses like from high ground, for example. For those reasons, I will always consider cantrips that require a saving throw to be weaker than those that require an attack roll. So that being said, I'm going to have to put Acid Splash in C tier. I just don't think it's very good, and there are several damage dealing cantrips that are much better. Okay, next up is Blade Ward. It's an abjuration cantrip that can be picked up by the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, the Eldritch Knight, and the Arcane Trickster. This is a buff cantrip that allows you to only take half damage from bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing attacks for 2 turns. This is definitely situational. You have to really anticipate when you might need this, though it certainly can be useful if used in the right situations. I wish that it lasted longer than 2 turns, and the fact that it doesn't means casting this while out of battle, it just makes it less valuable. Like there are those buffs, such as Bless, that you can cast it right before you go into battle, and by the time you cast it and walk over and hop into battle, you usually wasted a turn or 2, but you still have, 7, 8, maybe even 9 turns left to be able to make use of it. But in this case, if you cast it before you enter turn-based combat, 2 turns is likely not enough for you to get any real use out of it, which means that you'll have to cast it in battle and burn an action. That said, one of its real saving graces is that it works very well in conjunction with other spells like Armor of Agathys and Flame Shield. So you can really design a successful build around these spells, and it could potentially be very powerful for you if you build the character in the right way and use it in the right way. So even though it is a strong spell, due to its situational nature, I'm going to go ahead and put it in B tier. Okay, next up we have Bone Chill. This is a necromancy spell. It's available to the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, the Arcane Trickster, the Circle the Spores Druid, the Eldritch Knight, and the High Elf and the High Half Elf. Bone Chill is part of a small family of damage-dealing cantrips that not only deal damage, but also do an extra ability on top of that. And for these cantrips, I'm always going to rate them a little bit higher. Any spell that can do multiple things at once, or has additional bonuses on top of just the damage, is always going to be rated a little bit higher in my opinion. So in this case, it deals 1d8 necrotic damage, but it also prevents your target from healing until the next turn. And there's actually a third thing, an undead target. If you're fighting the undead, and there's plenty of undead in BG3, the undead target receives disadvantage on their attack rolls. I will say that this mechanic was likely introduced in a way to balance this cantrip because undead not all of them, but many of them are actually resistant, some even immune to necrotic damage. So this is likely a way to balance that out. Overall, this is a really solid cantrip. It deals decent damage and has these added benefits as well. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in A tier. Okay, next up, there's Dancing Lights. This is an evocation cantrip. It can be taken by the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Wizard, the Arcane Trickster, and the Eldritch Knight. What this spell does is it essentially creates these lights that just spin around and illuminate the area that you're in. It lasts 10 turns and requires your concentration. So this helps with not having dark vision. If you don't have dark vision in this game, you're going to find yourself rolling with disadvantage often. So a spell like this can be very powerful in those situations. You can light up the battlefield and negate that dark vision penalty. In a vacuum, Dancing Lights is a very solid cantrip. But that said, I believe that the light cantrip is a much better option. It essentially does what Dancing Lights does, but only better. Now I know that there are some people in the comments that are going to talk about how Dancing Lights can also trigger traps, and that's true. You can cast this spell on a trap and spring the trap. Here's why I don't really care about that. Because in every one of my parties, I have at least one character that has a very good sleight of hand skill. I highly recommend that you do too. Sleight of hand is an extremely important skill to have in this game, and while not every character has to have it, every party should have at least one person that is very good with sleight of hand. You need to be able to disarm traps and pick locks. If you're using Dancing Lights as your sole purpose for disarming traps, you've got bigger problems. I highly suggest you go visit Mr. Withers for a respec. Yeah, at the end of the day, I have to put Dancing Lights in D tier, and that's just because light is just so much better. I really see no reason why you would take Dancing Lights over light. Again, that's just my opinion, but I'm picking light 100% of the time, which means 0% of the time I'm taking Dancing Lights, which definitely lands it in D tier for me. Alright, next up we got Eldritch Blast. You know it, you love it. It's the infamous evocation cantrip for the Warlock. This cantrip can actually only be picked up by the Warlock unless you take, there's two different feats that can get it for you as well. You can take the Spell Sniper feat or the Warlock Magic Initiate feat, and you can also get the cantrip that way. But that said, if you do go that route and take Eldritch Blast through the feats, you end up with a much less powerful, much more watered down version of it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Starting off, Eldritch Blast does 1d10 force damage. Now something I haven't mentioned yet is that cantrips actually scale up with your character. When you level up, the damage dealing cantrips level up with you essentially. At level 5, they will double their damage, and at level 10, they will double their damage yet again. Eldritch Blast scales up a little bit differently. Instead of doubling its damage, you get an additional beam. Now this is far more powerful because you can still choose to use all of the beams on one target, or you can divide it up and attack multiple targets at once. And what makes this especially powerful is that any bonuses that you have to the damage, whether it be from any of your character's abilities or any magic items, any additional bonuses are added not to the entire roll, but to each beam. This makes this cantrip far more powerful than all the others. And just at level 2, the Warlock gets access to their invocations. And when you get these, you are likely going to take Agonizing Blast, which allows you to deal your Charisma modifier bonus twice to each beam, and Repelling Blast, which allows each beam to knock your opponent up to 15 feet away. Yeah, this takes Eldritch Blast to a whole nother level, and the fact that it's a cantrip and you can just spam it really makes it one of the most powerful offensive weapons in this game. That's why it hands down goes into S tier. It's our first S tier spell, I think there's no question about it. That said, if you do get this spell from taking a feat like Spell Sniper or Magic Initiate, it is not the same. I have to put it in A tier then. You are giving up the Warlock's invocations, and without Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast, it is simply not the same. It's still powerful, it's still a good cantrip, but it is not the powerhouse we know and love without the Warlock's invocations. Okay, next up there's Firebolt. It's an evocation cantrip. available to the Wizard, Sorcerer, Arcane Trickster, Eldritch Knight, the High Elf, and the High Half Elf. This does 1d10 fire damage. So aside from Eldritch Blast, it's the only other cantrip that is made with an attack roll that does this much damage. It is essentially the highest damage dealing cantrip available that's not a save cantrip that is available to classes outside of the Warlock. It's because of this high damage, plus the extra utility that you get from being able to blow things up, that I'm going to put Firebolt in A tier. I mean, I guess it doesn't technically fall under the category of being able to do multiple things at once, though it kind of does. There's lots of things in the game's environment that you can interact with that are explosive, including like the grease and the web spell that makes the Firebolt that much more powerful. But again, the fact that it's the highest damage dealing attack roll cantrip, that alone should really put it in A tier in my opinion. Like, I don't know why you would ever not take it, but the environmental interactions are just a kind of a bonus on top of that. Okay, next up is Friends. Friends is an enchantment cantrip available to the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, Eldritch Knight, and Arcane Trickster. What this does is it gives you advantage on charisma checks against non-hostile creatures. It lasts 10 turns and requires your concentration. The concentration thing doesn't really apply very much here. Typically, I would say that you have to be very careful about the amount of spells that you take that require concentration, because even though there are some of the more powerful spells in the game, you don't want to load up on all concentration spells because you can only cast one at a time. That doesn't really apply too much here because Friends is pretty much 100% of the time going to be cast outside of combat. You're going to use this spell during dialogue interactions, and if used properly, it will help you pass your charisma checks and sometimes even bypass certain battles if you succeed with those checks. I know a lot of you love this cantrip. I see people talking about it all the time in the comments, saying how you should take it and how great it is. And judging by that, I think a lot of you would probably put Friends in A tier. But even though it may disappoint some of you, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree and place Friends in B tier. Now, that doesn't mean I think it's garbage or something. B tier is good. It's only one rung below A. So for all you Friends lovers out there, let's not get too worked up about this. Allow me to explain why I don't think it belongs as high as A. Now, in D&D, I always recommend playing to your strengths. There's usually multiple ways to accomplish something, and the best way for you to go about doing something is to pick a path that your character is good at. If you're a real brute, like a half-orc barbarian that only has a 10 in charisma, maybe charming people isn't the best way to go about doing things. If you do use a social interaction, intimidation is probably a better fit, and if that fails, you can always go full-on murder hobo and kill everyone to solve your problem. Now, if you're a charismatic sorcerer, on the other hand, the face of the party perhaps, then yeah, charming someone to do something you want is quite possibly the best path forward. And if that is the case, do you really need advantage? Most skill checks in this game have a DC between 10 and 15, or easy and medium, with only the occasional hard check at 20 or higher. If your character has high charisma, they're going to be able to pass most of these charisma checks in the game, no problem. Even for those times that you do fail, the game has a pretty generous inspiration system, so you'll likely have at least 1 or 2 inspiration points that you could spend to do a reroll. Now look, if Friends gave you like a plus 10 bonus, like Pass Without Trace does for stealth, then I'd put it in A. But truth is, Pass Without Trace is a 2nd level spell, so I'm probably asking too much to apply such a bonus to this cantrip, and I get that. But I just don't see having advantage, as powerful as a mechanic as advantage is, I just don't think that it's that much of a game changer on a single roll. Like, if you have poor charisma, then it's totally possible that you could roll a check with advantage and just fail both rolls. And if you have good charisma, then I think more often than not, you're going to pass these checks without even needing advantage at all. All that said, I suppose this cantrip is best reserved for those PCs that have a middling charisma score, in which case I would recommend it then. But this is why I consider it situational or build dependent, which would be landing it in B tier for me. I mean, again, if you have very bad charisma, best not to rely on charisma checks to bail you out. And if you have great charisma, I think your limited number of cantrips would be best served elsewhere. But again, for some of you with charisma that's like 12 or 14, sure, grab friends. It could come in handy sometime when maybe you wouldn't otherwise be able to talk your way out of a sticky situation. Okay, next up is Guidance. Guidance is a divination cantrip. It can be picked up by the cleric, the druid, and the pack of the tome warlock. Guidance is probably, well, not probably, it's definitely the most widely used spell in the game. If someone in your party has Guidance, you're using this spell more than any other, because you should really be using it every single time that you do an ability check outside of combat. Anytime that you have a skill check that you have to do, you just click add bonus and you can add this 1d4 bonus to your skill check. I can't tell you how many times this little added bonus helped me pass some crucial skill check that I had to pass. Especially when I'm holding my breath and I have to make a skill check for like one of my dump stats. Having this little bonus is just so helpful. And if you're one of the classes that can take it, it's an absolute must pick. So as this video goes on, you'll see how selective I am about what I'm putting in S tier, but this is one of the few that is going to make it up there. I think Guidance is 100% S tier. The fact that it's a cantrip and you can just spam it over and over again and keep getting the bonus for these ability checks is just huge. It's S tier all day. All right, next up, another very good one, Light. Light is an evocation cantrip. It's available to the Bard, the Cleric, the Sorcerer, the Wizard, the Arcane Trickster, and the Eldritch Knight. Now, Light is available until a long rest. So you would cast this on one of your companions or yourself, or whoever in the party doesn't have dark vision. As I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, I think it's better than dancing lights in just about every way. For one, the light follows you around. You're not just lighting up one area in which when you walk away, it's no longer effective. It doesn't matter. And then you have to recast it and you recast it again. And that just gets to be kind of a pain in the ass, in my opinion. I like how the light follows you around. But for those of you who are concerned about stealth, the good thing about the light cantrip is that because it's lighting up your weapon and not yourself or your clothes or your body or whatever, you can just swap out weapons. Like if you needed to be sneaky for a minute, you can swap out weapons, the light goes away, and then when you want it to come back, you can switch the weapons back and it's still lit up. So I love that ability to kind of turn the light on and off. I think that's great. And I'm actually going to put this in the A tier because I think the ability to light up the battlefield, to negate any of the dark vision penalties that might be imposed on any of your characters without dark vision is just huge. And it's also just helpful to light up the screen for the player to be able to see the environment a little bit better in those deep, dark dungeons. So I just think it's really, really useful. I love the fact that it lasts until a long rest. And it's basically the one-stop shop for, solving the problem of not having dark vision. So for that reason, it's going to land in A tier. All right, next up we got Mage Hand. Mage Hand is a conjuration cantrip. It's available to the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, and the Eldritch Knight. Mage Hand allows you to conjure a floating hand that will do your bidding by interacting with objects or the environment in some way. Perhaps the most common way to use Mage Hand is by sending it into a treacherous area where you would prefer not to go. For example, there's a particular moment in BG3 where you may want to grab a book, but it's sitting in this small room that's going to get bombarded by firebolts as soon as you enter. You can always send Mage Hand in there and grab the book for you, and the problem's solved. There are actually several creative ways to use this cantrip. One that comes to mind for me is a time in the game where I actually used Mage Hand to push a flammable barrel down a hall into another room with a bunch of bad guys, push the barrel close to a cluster of them. Then when I remained hidden in the hallway, I shot a flame arrow at the barrel and it went boom. So Mage Hand's great. It's fun. And I consider it a must pick for the classes that have access to it. So for that reason, I will put it in A tier. And then next up, we have Minor Illusion. Yet another very good cantrip. As you might have guessed, it is an illusion cantrip. It's available to the Bard, the Eldritch Knight, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, the Way of the Shadow Monk, and the Arcane Trickster. What it does is it allows you to create illusion. In this case, in this game, I think it's always a cat. But you create this cat and it distracts your enemies. The description says it compels nearby creatures to investigate. So yeah, you cast this illusion that distracts your enemies, and they go check it out, and usually this is best used for stealth. You can, sneak by your enemies when they're distracted. There's a couple other good creative uses for it, though. You can use this to kind of group the enemies close together, and you can cast an AoE spell on them. Like, you get them all close together and just fireball their ass. That's always fun. You can also put the illusion like next to a cliff, get them to go by the cliff, and then you can use like Eldritch Blast or Thunder Wave to blow them off the side. So it can be very, very useful. And again, this is another one that I would really consider a must pick. I think it's good to have a balance of damage and non-damage dealing cantrips available to you. And this is definitely one of the stronger non-damage dealing cantrips in my opinion. And I'm going to go ahead and put it in A tier. Alright, next up is Poison Spray. This is a conjuration cantrip. It can be picked up by the Druid, the Eldritch Knight, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, and the Arcane Trickster. This allows you to puff out a cloud of poisonous gas. It actually does 1d12 of poison damage. So this is technically the highest damage dealing cantrip. Though that said, it is a save cantrip. It requires a Constitution saving throw. So as you know, that is a big count against it in my opinion. On top of that, poison damage is highly resisted in this game, and yet another count against it is that it has fairly short range. It's not a melee spell, though the range is only 10 feet. So despite it being 1d12 of damage, I think there's just too many counts against this cantrip. So even though it does have the 1d12 worth of damage, I feel like this was made to make up for all of the other shortcomings that this cantrip has. And to me, it just doesn't make up for it. If those other few that we just went over are must picks, this is like the opposite of this. This is a never pick. I mean, I guess if you're trying to build a poison damage centric character that's really relying on poison damage, I don't know why you would do that, because poison damage, like I said, is a very resisted damage type in this game. So I wouldn't recommend building such a character, and I definitely don't recommend taking this spell. So we are going to be putting it in D tier. Alright, so moving on, we come to Produce Flame. This is a conjuration cantrip that is available to the Cleric and the Druid. It produces a single flame in your hand that sheds light and deals 1d8 fire damage when you throw it. So Produce Flame actually does what light does and what Firebolt does. It just doesn't do it as well as either one of those other two cantrips. And I would never pick it over the other two if I had the option. But it's important to note that this is only available to the Cleric and the Druid, and because of that, this cantrip could be considered a good pick in very select situations. The best situation that would justify taking this is that if you were a Druid who doesn't have dark vision, as Druids don't get access to light or to Firebolt. Now, if you're a Cleric that really wants to have a flame-based cantrip, you could justify taking it, though Clerics do get the light cantrip, so they shouldn't really take this solely for a solution to not having dark vision. Otherwise, I just don't think it's that great of a pick. But once again, because we're dealing with something that's situational or build dependent, it will land Produce Flame in B tier. Okay, next up we have Ray of Frost. This is an evocation cantrip. It's available to the Sorcerer, the Wizard, the Eldritch Knight, and the Arcane Trickster. This is another cantrip that not only deals damage, but has an added effect. It does 1d8 cold damage, but at the same time, it reduces the target's movement by 10 feet. Reducing your target's movement can be so useful if that target is a melee-focused character. If they don't have any ranged attacks, they have to get up to you in order to do damage. And if you slow their movement down, they may not be able to do that. Or perhaps they have to burn their action in order to dash, in order to get close to you. So there's been countless times where I've used this spell, and that reduced movement has helped me a ton. But on top of that, it does cold damage. And in this game, if you impose the wet condition on your opponent, this will double cold and lightning damage. This is a very solid strategy in this game. And because of that, I've come to really value all of the spells that do cold and lightning damage. Ray of Frost is without a doubt an A tier cantrip, due to the cold damage and the fact that it has that additional perk of slowing your enemies down. Okay, next up we have Resistance. It's an abjuration cantrip that's available to the Cleric and the Druid. Resistance is essentially guidance, except it's for saving throws as opposed to skill checks. This is far less useful. It just doesn't come up all that often. Saving throws outside of combat are relatively rare. So the fact that you are kind of forced to use this in combat to have any kind of impact requires you to have some foresight on when it would be useful. You would need to identify the target that is going to need to make the saving throw, in addition to just knowing that a saving throw is imminent. On top of that, you need to be in melee range, and it requires your concentration. So I'm not going to say that resistance is never going to come in handy. There may be times where you might be glad you picked it, but it's extremely situational, and I feel like a lot of the times if you're using it in battle, it might be kind of a waste. You burn an action to use it without even really knowing for sure if it's going to make any kind of difference. So I really don't think resistance is all that great, which is why I'm going to put it in C tier. Okay, next up is Sacred Flame. It's an evocation cantrip that's available only to the cleric. This cantrip does 1d8 radiant damage, and it is a save cantrip. It requires a dexterity save from your opponent, but I'm going to rate this slightly higher than my other save cantrips, because I think it is a little bit better. Number 1, radiant damage is not only one of the least resisted damage types in the game, but there are several enemies, namely the undead, who are often vulnerable to it, which means you're going to be doing double the damage. On top of that, it can't be blocked like other ranged spells can. Like sometimes in this game when you try and shoot someone with a ranged attack, it'll tell you that the path is interrupted, that something is blocking your way. But see, this cantrip allows you to, you're not actually shooting a flame at them, you're looking at your target and they just kind of burst into flame. So it's okay if the path is interrupted, that doesn't count against you with this. So that makes it a little bit more valuable. I'm actually going to put it in B tier, though I will say you need to be aware of your target's dexterity number. I don't recommend casting this on targets that have a very high dexterity, or you'll find that it often misses. So yes, the fact that this is a save cantrip does count against it. Honestly, if it was a straight attack roll, I would no doubt put this in A, maybe even S, because I do feel that radiant damage is that powerful. But the fact that it requires a dex save does bring it down a little bit, but I think it rests comfortably in B tier. Okay, next up we have Shillelagh. This is a transmutation cantrip available to the Druid and the Nature Domain Cleric. This allows you to infuse your staff with this magical energy that lets you put your spellcasting ability, in this case Wisdom, and tack that modifier onto your attack rolls in addition to the 1d8 bludgeoning damage that it does. This is a great cantrip. You're not going to use it all the time, but for those times that your druid is face to face with an enemy and has to engage in melee combat, it's perfect, especially because it only requires a bonus action. So say you're going toe to toe, you don't want to cast a ranged spell attack and take disadvantage for it, you can use your bonus action to cast Shillelagh on your staff and then just attack with the staff. And it makes a quarterstaff attack relatively powerful. So unless you're making a druid that is melee focused, you're not going to be using it all of the time. But for those times that you're forced into melee combat and maybe you don't want a wild shape or you don't have any wild shapes left, Shillelagh can come in very, very handy. If it costs a regular action, I would no doubt be putting it in B, but the fact that it's a bonus action elevates it just a bit. So we're going to put Shillelagh in A tier. Okay, next up we have Shocking Grasp. That's an evocation cantrip. It's available to the Sorcerer, the Wizard, the Arcane Trickster, and the Eldritch Knight. It does 1d8 lightning damage. And once again, this is one of the damage-dealing cantrips that has a little bonus to it. In this case, your target cannot use reactions. And this spell has advantage on creatures that are wearing metal armor. So it does a few different things. In addition, this is the only melee cantrip. Now, most ranged spellcasters aren't going to be in melee range all that often, though it is nice to have the option, as I discussed with Shillelagh, to be able to have something to go to when you are in melee range. Also, if you're like an Eldritch Knight, for example, who has access to this, if you're a Gish type character, a frontliner who can also use magic, Shocking Grasp is very powerful. And as mentioned, this is a lightning spell, so you can use it with that wet condition and double your damage. So Shocking Grasp has a lot going for it. And like the other damage-dealing cantrips that do multiple things, I am going to be putting it in A tier. Okay, next up we have Thaumaturgy. This is a transmutation cantrip available to the Cleric as well as the Zerial and Asmodeus Tiefling. Thaumaturgy gives you advantage on intimidation and performance checks. So this is kind of like Friends, except instead of charming your opponents, you're intimidating them. But it's still used much in the same way. If I'm going to be choosing to intimidate my opponents, most of the time I'm going to do so with a character with high intimidation. I'm not going to be relying on a cantrip like this in order for me to be able to successfully intimidate. Is it a nice bonus to have? Sure, especially if my intimidation is lacking. But that said, if my intimidation is lacking, I likely won't go the intimidation route. In this game, I played my strengths, which is why, for the same reason as Friends, I'm going to put it in B tier. Okay, next up is Thorn Whip. Thorn Whip is a transmutation cantrip that's available to the Druid, the Nature Domain Cleric, and the Pact of the Tome Warlock. This does pretty much what it sounds like. It has you conjure up this thorny whip, and when you use it on your opponents, it deals 1d6 damage, but it also pulls that opponent 10 feet closer to you, so long as the target isn't huge. If the target is medium size or smaller, which typically is the case, you'll pull that opponent in. This can be a very powerful tactic. Not only can you use Thorn Whip to just pull an enemy closer, you can also use it to pull an enemy through AoE damage like Cloud of Daggers or Firewall, or there are actually cases where if you're standing on the edge of a cliff and your opponent is on the other side, you can use it to pull them into the pit. You can actually one-shot some seriously powerful opponents with Thorn Whip if used in this way. I consider it an absolute must-pick for the Druid, and for that reason, I do put it in A tier. Alright, almost done, just got a couple more left. Next up, we got True Strike. It's a divination cantrip. It's available to the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, the Wizard, the Eldritch Knight, the Arcane Trickster, and the Ranger with the Mage Breaker ability. What True Strike does is it gives you advantage on your target for 2 turns. Okay, when new players first read the description for True Strike, many of them see what they think would be a fairly good cantrip, but most experienced players know better, and let me warn you, this cantrip kinda sucks. It's very deceptive in its wording. While it says that it grants you advantage for 2 turns, because it costs an action to use, you really only get that advantage for 1 of those turns. Unless you drank a potion of speed or have haste cast on you, then you actually burn your action for 1 turn, then have to wait until the next turn, which, let's face it, in a big battle, anything can happen. Maybe by the time it gets back around to you, that opponent isn't even still standing. On top of that, it only applies to you and this single target, and it requires your concentration. It's really kind of a shame to see this have to go in D tier because honestly, there's a number of things Larian could do to make it better. They could remove the concentration mechanic. They could allow you to give advantage to you and your companions. They could make it a bonus action. They could allow you to select 3 different targets instead of just the 1. If they did really any one of these things, it would dramatically improve the True Strike cantrip. However, in its current state, this is widely considered to be the worst cantrip in the game, which will obviously, without question, land it in the basement of D tier. Okay, so for our last cantrip, we have Vicious Mockery. This is an enchantment cantrip that is available to the Bard and the Pact of the Tome Warlock. It does 1d4 psychic damage, as well as imposes disadvantage on your target for 1 turn. Okay, so let me just say, I do really like this cantrip. I think it's a really fun one. I love picking it for the Bard. It's very thematic, very fun from a role-playing perspective. I mean, you're literally insulting someone so bad that it hurts them. So absolutely perfect for the Bard class. And there would have been a time, not too long ago, that I would have put this in A tier. In fact, it did actually make my list of best cantrips in my other video. Not too high on the list by any means, but it was on there. However, after some serious consideration, I've decided I'm going to put it in B tier. I mean, the 1d4 damage is just so low, it's almost non-existent. The average damage is what, 2? Actually, it also requires a save, so maybe that even brings down the average to a single hit point per turn. I don't know, I haven't done the math, but I don't really need to. I mean, yeah, it's a fun cantrip to use. Yes, giving your opponent disadvantage for a turn is another little bonus. That's great. And yeah, there are times when your enemy just has 1 or 2 hit points left, and this is a good way to finish them off without having to burn a spell slot. Vicious Mockery does have its place in the game, and that's why I'm putting it in B and not C or D tier. However, I just can't justify putting it in A tier when it does such minimal damage. It's fun, it can be useful in the right situation, and yes, for me, it's always a pick for the Bard, but ultimately, I think B tier is where it fits most appropriately. Okay guys, so that will wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed the tier list. If you agree or disagree with any of my rankings, feel free to leave your comments below. I just ask that you keep things respectful, keep things civil. Remember, this is just my opinion, but if you did enjoy the video, I do ask that you like and subscribe. I'm going to be coming out with the level 1 spell rankings very, very soon, along with the rest of the spells in the game, so keep an eye out for that. Alright, thank you very much everyone, take care, and until next time, happy gaming.